My name is Martin Ellis and I am 47 years old. 2 months ago, I sat in the back of a banquet hall in a rented tuxedo and watched a wealthy man named Chandler Vance walk to a podium to accept an award as the founder of a charity I built with my own hands over 20 years, a charity he had joined only 3 years before. He had a speech in his jacket pocket. He had a photographer he had hired. He had the regional press in the room, because this award was his stepping stone to something bigger. And he had spent months making sure the whole county would be watching the night Chandler Vance was crowned the great man who fed the hungry of our valley. He walked up to that podium glowing, and he adjusted the microphone. And he opened his mouth to begin the speech that would erase me completely. And that is the exact moment the truth walked through the door, because I had spent the previous month quietly making sure it would, and Chandler Vance never saw it coming, because it never occurred to him that the quiet man he had pushed aside had any weapon at all. For 3 years, Chandler Vance had used his money and his charm to take over the community food bank and assistance fund that I founded in my own garage, that I grew from feeding 4 families to feeding 400. That was the work of my entire adult life. He maneuvered his way onto the board, then into the chairmanship. Then he pushed me out entirely, telling everyone that my methods were outdated and the organization needed to modernize. And then, worst of all, he began to rewrite its history, presenting himself in every interview and every fundraising letter as the visionary who had built it, until a charity born in my garage had become, in the public story, the great achievement of Chandler Vance. But here is the one thing Chandler Vance did not understand about the thing he stole. He thought a charity was a name on a letterhead and a room full of donors he could impress. He did not understand that it was 20 years of families and receipts and photographs and founding documents and living people who remembered exactly who showed up at their door with groceries when they had nothing. He stole the letterhead. He could never steal the truth because the truth was scattered across 400 kitchens in our valley, and all I had to do was gather it. Before we get into this, if you are new here, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. And while you are here, do me a favor and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every one of them, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to a hard winter 20 years ago, and to the first 4 families and to the reason I started something I never once wanted my name on. I grew up in Cedar Hollow, a town of about 5,000 people in the hills, where the mills used to run before they closed. When the last mill shut down, when I was a young man, it took the heart out of our town for a while. People who had worked good jobs their whole lives suddenly could not pay their heating bills, and there is a particular shame in a proud working town when the cupboards go bare. A shame that keeps people quiet and keeps them from asking for help. I saw it up close, because my own family went through a hard stretch after my father lost his mill job. And I remember as a boy the specific quiet of a house where the adults are pretending at dinner that they are not hungry so the children can eat. I never forgot that quiet. It is the reason for everything that came after. I remember one night in particular from that hard stretch when I was maybe 10. There was a knock at our door after dark, and when my father answered it, no one was there. But on the step was a paper sack of groceries left by someone who did not want to be seen. And I remember my father standing in the doorway holding that sack, a proud man who had worked the mill his whole life, and I saw something move across his face that I did not have a word for then and do that I do now. It was relief and shame fighting each other, and the shame was losing only because the relief was so total. Whoever left that sack understood something, understood to knock and disappear, to spare my father the worst part, which was being seen needing it. We never found out who it was. My father never spoke of it. But I have thought about that anonymous knock my whole life, and when Diane and I left that first box on a porch 20 years later, I was, without quite realizing it, passing on a kindness that a stranger had done my family in the dark when I was a hungry boy. That is how these things actually work. That is what a charity really is when it is real. It is not a gala. It is a knock in the dark and the mercy of not being seen. I did not grow up to be a rich man or an important one. I drove a delivery route for a regional food distributor for most of my working life, which matters, because it meant I spent my days driving all over the valley, into every town and hollow, and I saw who was hurting. I married my wife Diane when I was 24, and Diane was the kindest person I have ever known, a woman who could not walk past a hurting thing without stopping, and it was Diane, really, who started it all, though she would never have taken the credit either. One December, 20 years ago, Diane heard that a family down the road, a mill family with 3 kids, had nothing for Christmas dinner and were too proud to say so. And Diane and I did not have much, but we had enough, and we quietly put together a box of groceries and left it on their porch at night so they would not have to feel the shame of taking it from our hands. And the next week, Diane heard of another family, and then another. And by the end of that winter, our own small savings were spent. And Diane looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "Martin, this is bigger than us." But it doesn't have to be. It just has to be organized. That was the whole beginning, my wife and a kitchen table, and the words, "It just has to be organized." I want you to know Diane a little because she is the reason for all of it, and because Chandler Vance never even knew her name. Diane was not a big personality. She was quiet and a little shy, and she blushed when anyone thanked her. And she had a way of noticing the person in the room that everyone else had overlooked. She worked part-time at the elementary school, and she knew before anyone else did which kids were coming to school hungry because she watched. That was her gift, just watching, and refusing to look away from what she saw. When we left that first box on the porch, she insisted we do it at night, not to be humble for our own sake, but because she said, "Martin, if they see it's us, then every time they pass us in town, they'll feel it. This way, they only feel that somebody cared." She understood the dignity of the hungry better than anyone I have ever met, and every single rule I later built the community table on came from her, from that one instinct to feed people without ever making them pay for it in shame. When people ask me now what my qualifications were to build a charity, a delivery driver with a high school education, I tell them the truth. I had no qualifications. I had Diane, and I had the sense to do what she said, so I organized it. I started very small in our garage. I talked to the grocery store about their day-old bread and their dented cans. I talked to farmers about their extra produce. I talked to my delivery route contacts about food that was going to be thrown out for being close to its date. And I built, slowly over years, a quiet operation that gathered up all the food this valley was wasting and got it discreetly, without fuss, without shame, to the families who needed it. We called it the Cedar Hollow Community Table. Because Diane said everyone deserves a place at the table, I kept it deliberately humble. No galas, no big public thank yous. We fed people quietly, the way Diane left that first box on the porch at night, because I understood, from my own boyhood, that the shame is half the hunger, and that a charity that makes a show of its own generosity is really just feeding itself. For 20 years, the community table asked nothing of the families but that they let us help. Let me give you a sense of how it actually worked, because the how is the whole soul of it. We never had a line. I hated lines. A line of hungry people waiting for a handout is a public performance of shame, and I would not do it. Instead, we delivered quietly, in unmarked boxes, to porches and back doors, on a schedule the families knew, so a man could tell his neighbors it was just a delivery and keep his head up. On my old delivery route, I had learned every back road in the valley, and now I used them to bring food instead of just moving it. We learned to read the signs of need without being told, the way Diane read the hungry kids at school, because asking is the hardest part, and we tried to spare people even that. When a mill hand broke his leg and could not work, groceries simply started appearing, and nobody made him ask. When a widow's heat got shut off in January, it got turned back on, and the how of it stayed quiet. Over the years, I learned the names and the stories of hundreds of families, and I carried them, and I never once repeated a one of them in public, because their trust was the whole thing I was actually building. The food was just food. What we were really handing people, box by box, was the message that they still belonged to a community that would not let them fall, and that they could take that help and keep their dignity whole. That is what Chandler Vance would later hollow out. He kept the food and threw away the dignity, because the dignity did not photograph. It grew because the need was real and because people trusted it. From 4 families that first winter to dozens, then to hundreds. We added a winter heating fund because I never forgot the cold houses. We added a program to quietly cover a family's groceries for a few months when a breadwinner got sick or laid off. I ran it out of a donated space eventually, with a handful of the most loyal volunteers you have ever seen. Retired teachers and church ladies and old mill hands, people who did it for love. I did the books myself, carefully, every dollar accounted for, because it was other people's trust I was handling, and I kept records, boxes and boxes of them, over 20 years, not because I ever thought I would need them, but because that is how you run a thing responsibly, and because I think now some part of me was keeping a record of Diane. Because here is the part of the story that breaks my heart. Diane, who started it all, who could not walk past a hurting thing, got sick in the 10th year, and she died in the 11th. And after that, the community table was not just my work. It was the last thing of hers still living in the world. Every family we fed was a candle I kept lit for my wife. I want you to understand that before I tell you what Chandler Vance did, because then you will understand that he did not just steal a charity from me. He tried to steal my wife's living memorial and put his own name on it. Chandler Vance came to Cedar Hollow about 4 years ago. He was a man of about 60, silver-haired and polished, recently retired from some executive career in the city, and he bought the big restored farmhouse on the hill and set about, in his words, giving back to his new community. And I want to be fair to him the way these stories require, because for a while I was genuinely glad he came. Vance had money and connections, and a gift for talking to important people, and when he took an interest in the community table, I thought, God has sent us some help. He joined our little board. He wrote a large check. He talked about taking the organization to the next level, about real fundraising, about growth, and I, a delivery driver who had built the thing out of dented cans and love, felt almost grateful that a man of his caliber would lend his shine to our humble work. I did not understand at first that to a man like Chandler Vance our humble work was not a cause. It was an opportunity. It was a ready-made good deed with an inspiring story, sitting in a small town, unclaimed, that a man could put his name on and ride to the kind of importance he craved in his retirement. The takeover was patient and it was polished, and I did not recognize it for what it was until it was nearly complete. Because it never looked like an attack. It looked like modernization. Vance suggested we needed a more professional board and brought on his own people, wealthy friends from his old life, until the retired teachers and church ladies who had built the thing were outvoted by strangers in expensive suits. He suggested my bookkeeping was too informal, that we needed real systems, which was not entirely wrong, but the effect was to take the finances out of my hands. He suggested that my quiet, no-fuss way of feeding people was outdated, that a modern charity needed visibility, needed galas, needed a public profile, needed, though he never quite said it, a face, and that face was not going to be a delivery driver in a windbreaker. Piece by piece, always in the name of growth and professionalism, Chandler Vance moved me from the center of the thing I had built to its edge, and he did it so smoothly, with so many reasonable-sounding words, that by the time I understood what was happening, I was already outvoted on my own board. There was one board meeting where I saw it clearly, too late but clearly. I had raised a concern that a new fundraising plan would spend most of what it raised on the fundraising itself, that the families would see little of it, and I had the numbers to show it. And Chandler Vance did not argue with my numbers. He did something far more effective. He smiled at me, warmly, sympathetically, the way you smile at an old man who has wandered a little off topic, and he said, "Martin, we also appreciate the heart you bring to this, the passion of the early days. But the world has changed, and we have to think bigger now." And around the table his people nodded, and the retired teacher who would have backed me had already stopped coming because she felt unwelcome, and I looked around and understood that it did not matter that I was right, because I had been recast. I was no longer the founder who knew this work better than anyone alive. I was the sentimental old-timer with the heart, to be patted and outvoted. That is a specific and brilliant kind of cruelty, to praise a man's heart in order to dismiss his mind, and Chandler Vance did it beautifully. I said nothing more that meeting. I had learned there was no winning a vote on a board he had built. The winning, if it ever came, was going to have to come from somewhere Chandler Vance did not control, and it took me a long time and a great deal of grief to understand where that was. And then he pushed me out completely. It came, as these things do, wrapped in kindness. Vance took me to lunch and he told me, with a hand on my shoulder, that I had done wonderful work in the early days, truly wonderful, but that the organization had outgrown my skill set, that it needed professional leadership now, and that perhaps it was time for me to step back and let the next chapter begin. He offered me an honorary title, Founder Emeritus, a nice plaque, a seat at the galas. He was, he said, only thinking of what was best for the mission. And I sat there in that restaurant, a man who had built this thing to keep his dead wife's kindness alive in the world, being gently retired from it by a man who had shown up 3 years earlier. And I felt a grief so deep it did not even have room for anger yet. I said very little. I took my honorary plaque. And I stepped back, because the board was his now, and there was nothing else to do. And because I was still at that point telling myself that as long as the families got fed, my pride did not matter. But the families did not keep getting fed the same way, and that is when the grief finally made room for the anger. Because Chandler Vance did not actually care about the quiet, shameless, humble feeding of hungry people. That was never the point for him. Under Vance, the community table changed. There were galas now, expensive ones, where wealthy people paid a great deal to eat a nice dinner and feel good, and a shrinking portion of what was raised actually reached a hungry family because so much of it went to the galas themselves, to the venue and the catering and the professional fundraiser and the glossy materials with Chandler Vance's photograph. The quiet heating fund, which did not make for good photographs, withered. The discreet grocery help for sick families, which no one could put on a banner, was deprioritized. The old volunteers, the retired teachers and church ladies drifted away, unwelcome in the new professional operation. And the families, my families, the proud, quiet people I had spent 20 years learning to help without shaming, were increasingly asked to show up to photo opportunities, to be grateful in public, to be the backdrop for Chandler Vance's generosity. The shame I had spent 2 decades protecting them from, Vance put back on them because their gratitude was useful to him. He was hollowing out the thing and keeping only the shine. I saw it happen to one family in particular, and it is the thing that finally broke something loose in me. There was a young mother I had helped quietly for a year after her husband got hurt, a proud woman who had struggled to accept help at all, and only did, because we made it so easy to keep her dignity. Under Vance's new way of doing things, she was asked to come to a fundraising luncheon and to tell her story, to stand up in front of a room of wealthy donors and describe how the charity had saved her family, because a real, grateful, struggling face raises more money than any brochure. And she did it, because she was grateful and did not know how to say no. And I heard about it afterward, how she had stood up in that room and wept while telling strangers the most private, painful chapter of her life, so that Chandler Vance's donors could dab their eyes and feel generous and write bigger checks. And I thought about my father in the doorway with that paper sack, about how the whole mercy of it had been that no one saw. Vance had taken a woman I had spent a year protecting from exactly that exposure and put her on a stage for money. That was the moment I stopped telling myself my pride did not matter as long as the families got fed. Because they were not just being fed anymore, they were being used. And Diane would never ever have stood for that, and Diane could not speak for herself anymore, so it was going to have to be me. And then came the rewriting of history, which was the part that finally lit the fire all the way. Chandler Vance began, in interviews with the regional paper, in fundraising letters, in his remarks at his own galas, to tell the story of the community table as his story. He spoke of how he had built it, how his vision had grown it, how under his leadership it had become the Valley's premier charitable institution. My name, and Diane's, simply disappeared from the telling. New donors and new board members genuinely believed Chandler Vance had founded the thing. A young reporter wrote a glowing profile calling him the man who fed the Valley. And when I read that profile in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Diane had said this is bigger than us, I sat very still for a long time because Chandler Vance was no longer just taking my work. He was erasing my wife. 20 years after Diane left that first box of groceries on a porch at night, a stranger was standing in the spotlight, taking a bow for her kindness, and she was not here to speak, and it seemed for a while that no one would ever know. Now, here is the moment I want you to pay attention to, because it is the moment everything turned, and it did not turn the way the rage in my chest wanted it to. When I read that profile, I wanted to storm into the next board meeting, into the next gala, and shout the truth at everyone that I built this, that Diane started it, that Chandler Vance is a thief in a nice suit. I had the boxes of records in my garage to prove every word. And I did not do it, and I want to tell you why, because the reason is the whole lesson of this story. I understood, sitting with that profile, that a bitter man in a windbreaker, shouting that he was the real founder at a gala full of Chandler Vance's wealthy friends, would look exactly like a sad, jealous nobody who could not stand to see the charity succeed. Vance had the room, the Polish, the story. If I shouted, I would only prove his version, that I was a small man who had been rightly moved aside. The truth, shouted by the wrong person in the wrong room, does not sound like truth. It sounds like sour grapes. So I closed the newspaper, and I got quiet, and I did the thing my whole life had trained me to do. I got organized. Because Diane was right 20 years ago, and she was right now. This was bigger than my pride. It just had to be organized. So I did not go to Chandler Vance, and I did not go to the board, and I did not post a word anywhere. Instead, I went down into the truth I had been quietly keeping for 20 years, the boxes in my garage, and I began to gather it, the way I had once gathered dented cans. And I want to tell you what was in those boxes, because it is a lesson in why you keep the humble records even when no one seems to care. There were the original founding documents of the Cedar Hollow Community Table, the incorporation papers filed 20 years ago, with my name and Diane's on them as founders. A matter of permanent public record that Chandler Vance in his arrogance had never even bothered to look up, because it never occurred to him that the paperwork of a garage charity would ever matter. There were 20 years of annual records in my own hand. There were hundreds of photographs dated, going back to the beginning, Diane and me loading a truck, the first volunteers, the growth year by year, and Chandler Vance did not appear in a single one until 3 years ago. There were newspaper clippings from the early years, small ones from before Vance rewrote the story, that told the true history plainly. And most powerful of all, there were the families. 20 years of families, hundreds of them, living all over the valley, who knew exactly who had shown up at their door, who remembered Diane, who had never once heard the name Chandler Vance until he started taking bows. And here is where I found the lever, the thing that turned a box of old records into something that could not be ignored. And it came, as these things do, from understanding exactly what Chandler Vance wanted. Because Vance did not take over the community table for its own sake. He took it over as a stepping stone. I learned that the Regional Community Foundation was going to honor him at a large public gala, with a prestigious philanthropy award, naming him, in effect, the founder and driving force of the community table, and that Vance intended to use that award, and that night, with the regional press in attendance, to launch himself into the larger public life he craved, a bigger board, a run at something, real importance. That gala was going to be his coronation. And I realized, sitting in my garage among the boxes, that Chandler Vance was about to build, at great expense, the exact stage on which the truth could be revealed. He was gathering the press, the important people, the whole watching county into one room, to shine a spotlight on the founder of the community table. All I had to do was make sure that when the spotlight came on, it revealed the truth instead of the lie. I did not do it by ambush, and I want to be clear about that because there is a right way and a wrong way, and the wrong way would have handed Vance his sour grapes story after all. I did it with the truth, delivered quietly to the people who had a duty to care about it. First, I went to the community foundation that was giving the award, privately, with my folder, the founding documents, the dated photographs, the early newspaper clippings, and I laid it before the people responsible for the honor, and I said, without heat, that I did not want an award, and I did not want a fight, but that they were about to name the wrong man the founder of something in public on the record, and that as an institution built on truth, they might want to know the actual history before they did. Foundations do not like to be embarrassed, and they especially do not like to give a founder's award to a man who joined 3 years ago when the real founder is standing in front of them with the incorporation papers. I could see the color change in their faces as they went through the folder. I want to describe that meeting a little more because the way I did it mattered as much as what I brought. I did not go in angry. I did not go in demanding the award for myself, because I did not want the award, and wanting it would have made me look like exactly the rival Vance would have painted me as. I went in calm, and I framed it as a kindness to them. I said I understood they were about to do something generous and public, and that I would hate for an institution as respected as theirs to be embarrassed later by getting the history wrong, and that I had simply come to make sure they had the full picture before the night. Then I let the documents speak. I laid the incorporation papers on the table, 20 years old, my name and Diane's right there, where anyone could have looked, and where no one ever had. I laid out the photographs in a row year by year, and let them watch Chandler Vance fail to appear in any of them until the very end. I did not editorialize. My father, if I had had a father like the men in some of these other stories, would have said the documents do not need your help. I let the truth be quiet and heavy, and let them draw their own conclusion, which they did quickly, because the conclusion was not complicated. By the time I gathered the folder back up, the head of the foundation was no longer thinking about how to honor Chandler Vance. She was thinking about how to avoid a disaster, and I would learn about how to do something right. Second, and just as important, I went to the old volunteers, the retired teachers and church ladies Vance had pushed aside, and to a handful of the founding families, including the very first family Diane ever helped, whose children were grown now and had never forgotten. And I simply told them the truth was going to come out, and asked if they would be willing to be in the room and speak it if the moment came. Every one of them said yes. They had been waiting years for someone to ask. That part moved me more than I expected. I had gone to them braced to have to explain, to persuade, maybe to be told to let it go. Instead, the moment I began, they finished my sentences. The retired teacher who had stopped coming to board meetings took my hand and said she had been sick about what had happened to the table, that she had felt it slipping into something cold and had not known what a person like her could do about a man like Vance. The gray-haired woman, the first family when I told her the truth was going to come out, was quiet for a long moment and then said only, "I have wanted to thank you for 20 years and never knew how to find you. Let me do it in front of everyone." I had thought I was alone in this. I was not. That is the other thing Chandler Vance never understood, because a man like him cannot understand it. He thought he had isolated me, moved me to the edge, made me a lone, sentimental old-timer with no allies and no power. But you cannot isolate a man who spent 20 years quietly knitting a whole valley together. The web Diane and I had woven, box by box, kitchen by kitchen, was still there, under everything, and the moment I reached for it, it held. That is the gala I began this story with. Chandler Vance had built his stage beautifully. The banquet hall, the press, the important people, the hired photographer, the glowing program that called him the visionary founder of the Cedar Hollow Community Table. And I was there, in a rented tuxedo, in the back, because as founder emeritus I had of course been invited to sit quietly and be part of the backdrop of Chandler Vance's big night. He did not know what I had done. He walked to that podium glowing, and he adjusted the microphone, and the room hushed, and he opened his mouth to begin. But the foundation, having seen my folder, had made a quiet decision of its own. Before Vance could give his coronation speech, the head of the community foundation stepped to the podium first and said that before presenting the award, she wanted to take a moment to honor the true and complete history of this remarkable organization and to recognize some people in the room without whom none of it would exist. And then, one by one, she called them. She spoke of a delivery driver and his wife who, 20 years ago, in a hard winter, began leaving boxes of groceries on porches at night. She read the names on the founding documents, and she invited the founding volunteers and the very first family to stand and be recognized. And they stood, the retired teachers and the church ladies, and a woman, now grey-haired, who 20 years ago had been too proud to ask for help and had found a box on her porch, and who now told that room in a shaking voice about the quiet couple who had fed her children without ever letting her feel ashamed, and whose names were Martin and Diane Ellis. And she asked, was Mr. Ellis here tonight, because she had never properly thanked him. I have never wanted to disappear more, and I have never been more grateful. In the same moment, the room turned and found me in the back in my rented tuxedo, and the applause that started then was not for Chandler Vance. I need to describe those few seconds because I have replayed them 100 times. When that grey-haired woman asked from the podium whether Mr. Ellis was here, there was a moment of confusion in the room, heads turning, people who had come to honor Chandler Vance suddenly hearing a different name, a name most of them did not know, attached to the beginning of everything. And then someone near me pointed, and the whole room turned, and I felt 400 pairs of eyes land on a delivery driver in a rented tuxedo who had come expecting to be part of the backdrop. And the applause did not start politely and build. It broke all at once like something released, because a room full of people had just understood, in the space of a minute, that they had been told a lie and were now hearing the truth. And there is a particular force to applause that is also an apology. I did not deserve it any more than Diane did, and she was not there to share it, and so I did the only thing I could bear to do. I found the grey-haired woman's eyes across that whole room, the woman who 20 years ago had been too proud to ask and had found a box on her porch, and I put my hand on my heart, for her and for Diane, and I let them clap, not for me but for the truth finally being in the room. And Chandler Vance stood beside his uncrowned award, grey-faced, holding a speech he would never give, and I did not even look at him. He was already, in that moment, the smallest thing in the room, and looking at him would have given him more attention than the night had left him worth. And I looked up at that podium, and I saw Chandler Vance standing there beside the award, meant to crown him, his speech still folded in his jacket, his polished face gone completely grey, understanding all at once that the stage he had built for his own coronation had just become the stage on which the truth was told, in front of the exact press and important people he had gathered to witness his greatness. He did not get to give the speech. There was no version of that speech he could give now. The award, I later learned, was quietly not presented that night, and was never presented to him at all. I did not gloat, and I did not speak, and I did not need to. Others spoke for me, which is 1,000 times more powerful than speaking for yourself. I simply stood when the old woman asked if I was there, and I said thank you, and that Diane would have loved to hear that her children were doing well, and I sat back down. That was all, but that was everything, because the truth was finally in the room, said by the people who had lived it, and no amount of Chandler Vance's money or polish could put it back in the box. Here is what happened after, and it is the part that matters more than Vance's ruined night. With the true history now public, with the founding documents and the real story out in the open, the board that Vance had stacked began to come apart, because it is one thing to follow a visionary founder, and another to follow a man just publicly revealed as having taken credit for another couple's life work. Within a few months, Chandler Vance was gone, resigned from the chairmanship, his stepping stone shattered, his hoped-for larger importance quietly evaporated, because word travels and no foundation or board wants the man from that story. He left Cedar Hollow within the year, and the community table, freed of him, came back to what it was. The old volunteers returned, the galas shrank, and the heating fund grew again. The quiet, shameless feeding of proud people resumed. They asked me to come back and lead it, and I told them I would help gladly, in the humble ways I always had, but that I did not need a title and did not want one, because I never did. I only ever wanted Diane's kindness to keep living in the world, and now it would, under its own true name. I want to tell you the last thing, because it is the only trophy I took from any of it. Sometime after that night, the very first family, the grey-haired woman who stood up at the gala, invited me to dinner, and at her table were her grown children. The children who had eaten from that first box of groceries 20 years ago, now with children of their own. And they told me, over that dinner, that they had never known who left the box, only that someone had, and that it had gotten them through, and that they had spent 20 years quietly trying to be the kind of people who leave boxes for others. Diane's kindness had not just survived, it had multiplied, in kitchens all over the valley, in people Chandler Vance would never impress and never understand. That is what he tried to put his name on. That is what he could never steal. I drove home from that dinner and I told Diane about it, out loud, in the car, the way I still do, and I think she heard me. I think she has heard me all along. So let me leave you with what 20 years and one thief taught me, and then I will let you go. The people who steal the credit for your life's work count on one thing above all. They count on you being too humble or too proud or too wounded to fight for it, and they count on the fact that the truth, spoken by the person it belongs to, always sounds a little like bragging or bitterness. So do not speak it yourself and do not shout it in the wrong room. Gather it. Keep the humble records that no one thinks matter, the founding papers, the dated photographs, the names of the people you actually helped. And then when the thief builds his own stage and gathers his own crowd to crown himself, do the patient thing and put the truth quietly into the hands of the people who lived it and let them stand up and speak it for you. A thief can steal a letterhead. He cannot steal 400 kitchens full of people who remember who really came to the door. My Diane said it best, 20 years ago at a kitchen table, and it turned out to be the answer to everything. This is bigger than us, it just has to be organized. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. And tell me honestly, has anyone ever taken credit for something you built and did the truth ever come out? I read every single comment, and I want to hear it. Take care of yourselves. Leave a box on a porch for someone if you can, and I will see you in the next one.